Hey, it's Surrey for Inspiration Fine Arts, and I'm going to be showing you guys how to use editing software, like basic editing software, not Photoshop, but stuff like Lightroom and Apple Photos would probably pretty much does the same thing. I know there's other apps like Darkroom. I'm just using Lightroom because that's what I'm comfortable with, and I'm going to be editing photos with it and kind of give you like a basic tour of all the features in Lightroom and how to use them. So when you first open it up and sign in, you get the home page, right? I don't really use this at all. Sometimes there's these guided tutorials which show how to do specific things in Lightroom, for example, like how to deal with fog or even how to edit for butterflies. And you can get more of these with Learn, and they're pretty good for some of them, but a lot of them are just confusing, so I don't like to use them. Discover, this is how I actually learned a lot of the edits and how to edit on Lightroom, which is you see specific photos, you see what edits they did, and you can click on the photos and you can specifically see how they edited each part of the photo and kind of see the exact keystrokes that they used. So how you import photos is just with this plus button up here. It goes to your Finder or File Explorer, and then you can navigate to the photo and then just import it in. So for this one, I already set up an album, but how you set up an album right here, just hit the plus, import, and then you can just right click and then add photo to album. I already added it, but you just go IFA or whatever album you want to add. And then this is basically like you recently added the date you took the photos. So this is your library. This is basically where all the organization happens. If you want to edit it, you go into this. This right here is the histogram, and it's basically a reading of the light data in a photo. And by light, I mean like the darkest points of a photo. So which for this photo would be right here and right here, which is where all the dark points are, and the lightest part of a photo, which would be here and also here and basically around here for this specific photo. And how you get this to show up is you hit the three dots, show histogram. So for light, basically you want to try to even this out in the light section, right? So it's really dark, which is why it's pushed all the way to the left. So I want to raise it to try to even it out. Now we got like a pretty even looking photo. I don't really mess with contrast too much here, just kind of maybe to like flatten it out a little bit. I don't like how much I raised it. There we go, perfect. Highlights is the lighter parts of the photo for this right here, right here. Shadows is the darker part of the photo, so here and like here, right? So I can raise the shadows and make it more bright, which just pushes it over here. I can decrease the brightness, which makes it like this. I think that's pretty good. Highlights, again, same thing, it just decreases it or brightens it. I don't want to decrease it too much. And really easy tip, expose for your highlights, because it's way easier to bring up the shadow and bring up shadow detail than it is to edit for the highlights and trying to like bring back the detail in them. The next thing on here is the tone curve, and this kind of is a little bit confusing to beginners, but I can explain it pretty well. So you have your histogram right here, right? So if there's a lot of light on one side, you want to basically try to even it out, but you want to try to keep a curve that's going up, if that makes sense. So I usually like to raise the black point because it gives a nice and faded look. Then the second thing you want to do is lower it and kind of flatten it out, and now you have a very contrast heavy photo. And to balance that out again, you raise this and then kind of just start messing with it to see how you can change the photo without actually making it not look good, and keeping it so one part of the photo doesn't kind of overtake the other, if that makes sense. Next, I just use the middle and I try to adjust it to see what I mean. If I completely go here, then it's obvious that these parts of the photo lose their detail completely and it doesn't look good. And so you have to kind of figure out how to start editing it until you are happy with it and you don't lose that detail. I want to just push this up a little bit. And once you get like used to using Lightroom, doing stuff like this comes very easily and comes very naturally. And since there's not that much light here, you can bring up the shadows, you can bring up the highlights, and it doesn't really affect the overall image that much. It just affects specific portions. But since there's a lot of color and a lot of things in the black part of the image, if I raise this, it affects almost all of the image. But if I just raise this, it only affects certain parts. Just like, there we go. Color is also very important, and color is essentially the four most important things are vibrance, saturation, and then the saturation luminance here. And then also like the color mixer and the vibrance saturation. So vibrance is essentially how intense the color is. And see, there's like no color at all here. It's all pretty much the same. But then I can push it all the way over there and it immediately separates into red, green, and blue, right? But I typically like to raise the vibrance a little bit just because it gives like a more cinematic feel, at least in my opinion. And I like that. And then lower the saturation to kind of give it like that nice faded look. And I use the targeter thing, which is right here, but you can use the sliders too. I just prefer using this because I personally feel like I'm faster with it. So hue is the specific like color of the photo. So for this color, it's green to dark blue and purple. So I don't want to go all the way purple, but I want to keep it somewhere within the blue region, which is right there. And then let's say for these lights, there we go. I can make them green, or I can make them, again, blue/teal. And I like to keep them over here. And I'm kind of happy with most of the hues, actually. So the next thing is saturation. And saturation, like before, is very similar. So lower it or raise it. I want to raise it right here because I want to bring attention to this part. And I like it kind of like the warmer color. I do want to lower the saturation here in this lighter sky because I feel like I can bring that back in with selective editing through these over here, which I'll show you guys later. The last thing to edit is luminance, and luminance, again, how intense and how bright the colors are. I want to make sure it's not too bright. And so just like slowly edit until you got your colors. This is how it originally looked, and now this is how it looks right now. So for effects, texture and clarity are kind of the same thing, and what they do is just sharpen your image or like blur it out. Except texture affects more of texture is like less impactful as clarity, since texture only affects saturation and luminance, which is why it does kind of wiggle the stuff up here, the histogram for the RGB curves, and why this like really just pushes them. So I typically like to have a little bit less clarity and a little bit more texture, especially for photos like this where you have leaves and stuff like that, but you also have really bright lights, right? And why I like to lower the clarity for the lights is because it gives off something called an Orton effect, which is kind of how you set that dreamlike feel. And dehazing is kind of really only for clouds and landscape photography, so I don't really use dehaze that much. But vignette is basically you can create a black circle or a white circle around the photo, and this kind of also adds to that little like old school kind of film feel. I don't really use it that much, maybe just a little bit, but no, I don't really use it that much. So grain is how grainy your photo is. Remember how I said before in the like shutter speed and the manual, shutter speed, ISO, and aperture manual video, is if you have too much grain, it's bad and it's too noisy. Well, that was because the grain in your sensor that comes from sensor and like raising your ISO does look weird and it does look bad most of the time. But the grain you put after you took the photo and in like post-processing the photo is actually looks kind of nice, and it's these little dots that you can see that give a lot of texture towards the photo. I typically give like around 40 to 50 grain, and then when you go inside, you can do the size of the individual particles. So if I make them super big, they become really easily noticeable, and if I make it really rough, it starts looking like it was on paper, and it doesn't look that good. So I usually just have the size at like 40, and then the roughness, I leave it at either like 50 or even raise it a little bit just to make sure it's noticeable but not like immediately noticeable, which is what I use for the grain. The next thing is split toning, and this is where the kind of the specific colors and the specific look of your picture really take place. And so again, you have shadows and highlights, right? So I can raise my shadows to one color and I can raise my highlights to one, maybe not the same color, that would be weird. So it shows, so it basically just takes all the shadows and all the highlights and makes them and tints them with one color. So for this, I'm just gonna lower that. For this, the shadows, I want them to be kind of blue, but not too intensely blue. Maybe like right there. Right, there we go. And then for highlights, I do want them to be warm and then green. But again, not too intense. So like push this blue over to the red, so it's, or maybe over here. There we go. And then, so now it creates more of like a film, like an old film feel, which I really think is cool because this is like a modern train, right? So it feels kind of out of place and it looks nice. There we go. Detail, sharpening is not really, I don't really use it that much. If there's like an edge or something that looks very dull in your photo, and there's a lot of edges that are dull in your photo, and it's just because you zoomed into the photo a lot, I guess, and you cropped it like you just cropped it and took this and you sharpened it, then it might help, but it still does leave like this weird artificial look on your photo. So I don't really use sharpening. Optics are basically just, it automatically happens. You can remove chromatic aberration, but even today's phones and even today's cameras rarely have that much chromatic aberration, where it's like a thing you need to worry about. So geometry is, you can distort the image, you can make it look kind of like deep fried and whatnot, and you can also scale it, and which is like zooming in, and it's basically just like cropping but manually. So I just prefer using the actual crop, and there we go. I like this. I like how it's cropped. There we go. So I crop it last before adding my radial gradients and whatnot. So for radial gradient, I do want to make sure this light isn't too harsh, and the way I'm going to do that is just going into my effects. Where is it? There we go. Texture, clarity, decrease the clarity, and it should, there we go. The light looks kind of more faded out, and I want to decrease the contrast and lower the highlights. There we go. Perfect. And then I also want to add a linear gradient right here for the train tracks, and then I want to darken the train tracks and make them a lot more punchy, and that creates like a fall off effect, which I think looks quite nice. And then finally I want to brush in the sky and make sure the sky is brighter, and the brush is just like a regular brush, and you can select what parts of the image you want to increase and raise up, and the size is basically just the size of the brush. And then for these, where it says feather, you can choose like the feather of the, there we go, feather. You can choose the feather of the radial gradients, and feather is basically how much it blends into the, that was considerate. So feather is how much it blends into the background and into the other parts of the photo. And finally, the healing brush. The healing brush isn't, you don't really need the healing brush for this photo, but what the healing brush does is you can, here, I'll show you on a really big scale. So you can clone parts of the image, which is really good for like portraits. See what I mean? And this is really good for portraits and stuff like that. So you can kind of edit out moles and edit out other parts of people's faces that they don't want, like acne. And you can just use Heal for that. You can visualize spots, and then you can just go about and clicking on the moles, and they pretty much just go away. So that's really neat. And the final thing is presets. I don't really use them ever, but you can use other people's like edits and other people's filters, and it basically just acts like an Instagram filter, and it kind of takes away the fun of photography for me. So I have a couple, but I rarely use these, and if I use these, I basically just edit them myself afterwards. But you can just look up free presets on Google, and you can definitely find a couple, and they are good for like learning how to edit and how to get like a specific type of look. But if you rely on them too much, your photography is not going to really become your photography, and it's going to just kind of mirror someone else's. So that's definitely it. And next week, I'm going to be talking about how to edit photos using Photoshop and like darken specific images, parts of the image and stuff like that. And like portrait retouching. And I will see you next week. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Hi, we are your IFA co-founders. I'm Ellie.
And I'm Miriam.
And thank you so much for watching our videos.
You guys can learn more about our cause down below at our website, www.inspirationfinearts.org.
And if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
We couldn't be where we are without the support of you guys, so make sure to send in videos of the things that you've learned during classes and pictures of the art that you completed.
Everything you send in will be featured on all our social media platforms.
Thanks for supporting us, and until next time,
go find your inspiration!